Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this breakfast briefing special, the morning after the inauguration of President Donald Trump. I'm Catherine Haddon, Programme Director here at the Institute for Government. Well, we've all watched the inauguration, as well as all the speculation and briefing about what a returning Trump presidency would bring. So what signals can we glean from all the noise, from the speech, from Trump's first acts, a slew of executive orders signed in front of a stadium audience? What does Trump's return to the White House mean for Keir Starmer, the government, and for British politics? And where Trump leads, how much does the rest of the world follow? We've got half an hour for this, so obviously a huge amount of material to get through and talk about. I'm thankfully joined by a superb duo to help us distill those signals from noise. Mark Landler is the London Bureau Chief at the New York Times. Thank you, Mark, for joining us. And Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri is Director of the US and the Americas Programme at Chatham House. Thank you, Leslie, for joining us.
Thank you.
Right, well, let's crack on. Mark, I'm going to turn to you first. What first impressions of the speech? How did it compare to the previous one? The famous George Bush quote about it, which I feel it's too early in the morning to quote that particular one. But
well, good morning, everyone. I guess he didn't use the phrase American carnage a second time, which he did in his first inaugural speech. And so to that extent, I suppose people were saying that it was maybe marginally less apocalyptic and angry than the speech he gave the first time. But there's no question that there was a whole lot of troubling stuff in the speech, as well as some, very kind of confident, optimistic sounding bold promises and pledges for the future. America's going to go to Mars. He talked a lot about the pioneer spirit, the frontiers.
Golden age.
Golden age for the country. In a way, the speech is an asterisk to everything that followed it, because, as you all know, he signed dozens and dozens of executive orders across an absolutely vast range of issues having to do with trade, foreign policy, domestic policy, border policy, social policy, energy policy. So there was really very little he left untouched in the hours after the speech. And I guess I was left with one sort of larger observation about it, which is that, when Trump was president the first time around, we in the press spent a long time debating whether one should take Trump seriously but not literally, or literally but not seriously. And I guess last night I sort of was left thinking, well, maybe we should take him literally and seriously. Because if you look at the content of those executive orders, many of those that he signed last night, they are literally delivering on what he said he was going to do in the campaign. And the overall message was, this is a man who plans to utterly transform America's role in the world, the relationship of the American government to its people, the whole notion of the role of the Constitution in American society. So I do think we're in a very different phase with Donald Trump. As many people said exhaustively in the final stages of the campaign, he comes into the job far better prepared, with a far more organized team. He has a Republican Party that is now 100% captive to him. He faces very little institutional resistance. He faces, among his political opponents, a largely exhausted movement that at the moment doesn't show much signs of how it's going to rouse itself to challenge a lot of what Trump is going to do. I'm confident that over time, people will rouse themselves and people will start mounting legal challenges. I bet you'll see the first 3 or 4 lawsuits against the Trump administration today.
I think there was some
there
within minutes,
was an ACL,
actually.
There was an ACL lawsuit filed in New Hampshire yesterday. So in fact, that's all beginning. People talked about in the Trump world that they wanted the first day, 2 days, 3 days to be one of shock and awe. And I think it's fair to say we saw shock and awe. So we got the president that we thought we were going to get.
Leslie, your reactions, I mean, yeah. Where do you start?
I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Mark said so articulately, as always, both in writing especially, but also in person. I guess I would add a couple of things to it. One is, you know, there is a sort of, we are all sort of leveled to it. So it's interesting that you sort of contrasted it back because we sort of said, you know, Trump, one, set a new level for our expectations. And at some baseline, I wasn't actually looking back to Trump one, I was looking kind of at it for where it is now. So I had a couple of reactions. One was that it was, you know, the first part of it was very nasty and divisive with respect to one group of people, and that is the people who used to run the country up until yesterday at noon.
Yeah.
And then a tail end of trying to project unity for the younger people in the next generation that are going to go to Mars and also to Panama. And it was incredibly nasty on that division. Secondly, is that it is going to be a struggle for America and for the world and for Americans to make sure that we hold on to our historical record of what is true and what is not true, if you believe that history matters, because there is so much rewriting of the facts. In the speech, of course, the claims about, you know, America's sort of been in the tank and now it's going to take off, we know just simply aren't true in economic terms. And on any number of dimensions, you know, the past record, many policies of which one can be very critical, but there's just not a level of accuracy. So we are going to be plagued by a problem from the very top. And we know this, but it was just made very clear in that speech that just knowing what the basic facts are is going to require a tremendous amount of energy from journalists, from historians, from everybody in the information space, which is pretty much everybody. The third thing that struck me was, you know, the amazing contradiction in his, in the base of folks who support him, which is 77 million Americans, and in the audience. And so you've got those people who want deregulation and tax cuts and freedom and free speech for sure. You know, the tech, as my colleague at SOAS calls them, the tech billionaires. It's a nice term, we're going to be talking about them a lot. And then the play to working class men in particular. And that contradiction is, you know, seen in the executive orders. It's seen in that duality between we can do anything we want, but also we're going to take measures that probably aren't good for America's economy. And so I'm not so sure that they'll be followed through. On the executive orders, it was a funny list because, as Mark said, you know, it was comprehensive. I agree in the seriously and literally point, but it was, you know, you go from, wow, this is really a serious change to, was this written by a you know, junior high school student? Some of it's really kind of a joke. I mean, you know, the one on free speech, we know that that what lies behind that is very significant, right? It's the attack on what they see to be a woke agenda that was radically anti-free speech. But if you read the executive order, it's like, we already have a constitution. We already have freedom of speech. So some of it's just sort of shoddy. You know, they've pulled out of the executive orders, one to pull out of the World Health Organization, one to pull out of Paris. I mean, fine, the Paris one says effective immediately, but I don't think you can pull out of Paris.
No, it's 1 year from when you submit your letter.
But it's not more than 1 year, because in the first term, it took us the entire term to get out, and then we didn't get out because as soon as Biden got out, he put us back in. So is it really only 1 year?
Well, the rules are you submit your letter telling the Paris, whoever the committee is, that you want to pull out, and it's the minimum amount of time is 1 year from when you submit the letter. Trump, though, if you remember, in the first term, pulled out of Paris maybe a year into it.
That's right. That's right. It was longer. So you know, you read those executive orders, and yes, I mean, the agenda is being kind of pushed forward, but it's not. So with some of them, they're not as. You know, this is not very significant because we already have laws, and with others, they can't be enforced. And then with others, they're really
Yeah,
pretty
there was.
serious.
I mean, I don't know if it was an executive order, but they shut down the app, didn't they, for if you're at the Mexican border applying
Yes, the
for an asylum
CBP1
thing.
app, that's it. I mean, the immigration border is very, very serious. And we did a trip to Mexico where we talked with a number of people working on the immigration issue in Mexico about this. They've anticipated this for a very long time. But the fact that he is, called a federal emergency at the border means he can mobilize funds from the Pentagon. The fact that he's removed the app means that there are a lot of people. It's a problem for Mexico. It's obviously a huge problem for the immigrants who suddenly, had appointments. And it was one of the smartest things that the Biden administration did was to put this app in place so that there could be a regularized legal path so that people didn't cross without an appointment. It was very clearly vetted and screened, and that has now been shut down. So the whole that crisis is going to be very significant. And with, final comment, with a real cost to the American economy. Mexican workers, legal and illegal, provide a huge bonus to the functioning of the U.S. economy in places where white Americans don't want to go. They don't want to do the jobs. And they also work at high levels of the economy. So the contribution that legal and illegal Mexicans make to the U.S. economy is extraordinary. So this is another area where watch the space. Will he dial it back or curtail it? Because a lot of folks won't like this.
Another area, Mark, where everyone was sort of, well, certainly on this side of the pond, were waiting to see would he give more detail. And again, something where could have an immediate effect on the US economy, tariffs.
Of course.
We heard, it was in the speech. He talked about another new agency for, I can't remember what it was called.
External revenue.
External revenue, yeah. Where he's going to bring, so much money, he says, from foreign countries coming in through taxes and tariffs and so forth, but not actually any detail there. Is that one of those areas that is really just a threat, like the threat to Canada and Mexico on 25% tariffs, or are we likely to see something?
I mean, again, I think a lot of people thought they had gotten a bit of a reprieve in the fact that the president didn't announce anything concrete. However, it's worth pointing out that at the end of yesterday, when he was speaking to journalists, he was asked about tariffs against Mexico and Canada, and he said, yeah, I think we'll do them on February 1st. So that is a 25% across-the-board tariff against our two biggest trading partners. And I think that if you were a Canadian official and you were feeling good at noon, you were feeling less good at 8 in the evening. He has not announced tariffs against the European Union or against the UK, but as you say, they were in his speech. I mean, I think there'll be a couple of things to watch here. One of the things is I think one of the very, very few restrictions on Trump's maneuverability or ability to act is the reaction of the financial markets and, of course, the economic fallout. If the financial markets were to react very, very badly to some of these early tariff moves, I think that would give him pause because he doesn't want to be remembered as the president who came in with a roaring bull market and managed to kill it within the first month or two. So I think that's one factor that could limit his maneuverability. I think also there is a policy debate within the Trump administration about tariffs. It's not a black and white debate. Some people are against them, some people are for them. It's more of a nuanced debate about how you use tariffs. Do you use tariffs in a more tactical way to extract concessions? Do you impose tariffs at a lower level and then ratchet them up over time? Or do you go all in with a kind of a nuclear bomb approach? And there's genuine debate on both sides. You have Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, a guy who used to work for George Soros and on Wall Street, tends to be much more conventional in his views, probably opposed to the nuclear bomb approach. And yet on the other side, you have Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor, who has for 25 years been an evangelist for using tariffs in a very, tough hammerhead approach to try to restore American manufacturing and change the competitive landscape in a radical way. That debate will now play out over the next couple of months. But I guess my thought, if you're Keir Starmer or I guess more importantly Rachel Reeves in this case, I wouldn't sleep on this and assume that it was a lot of noise, but we'll get through it. I think it's very possible that Trump will try the across-the-board radical approach. Because remember, if you look at Trump's political career going all the way back to when he first showed interest in politics, he really has only ideologically been wedded to a couple of issues. And one of them is the use of protectionism to restore American manufacturing and to right what he sees as a kind of a rigged system that has ripped off the United States for decades. And I sort of feel that when you get down to it, and you look at the guy's ideology, this is the one thing he cares about. So I'd be very concerned if I were Europe. I do not believe by any stretch that this threat has passed.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I want to turn to talking about the UK. Leslie, I mean, we've heard that obviously the government, you know, they're hoping for the best, but they've been wargaming scenarios of expecting the worst. Obviously, a lot of talk about Peter Mandelson as our new ambassador, including sort of hints dropped out into the newspapers today about Trump. A slip there. Trump might veto the appointment, or it might come with conditions, concern about the UK on Peter Mandelson's focus on China. What do you think the UK government should be doing? What's your advice to Peter Mandelson if he does become ambassador, or if he wants to become ambassador?
Mark will be closer to the behind-the-scenes conversation on whether that threat to get in the way of the British government's decision, the UK government's decision on who it wishes its ambassador to be. I understand that there's a normal process that is cleared. I would be surprised. It's low-hanging fruit, but I guess it's possible. To build a little bit on what Mark said in addressing your question, the problem is that there's never going to be certainty. There's only going to be certainty if he immediately comes out and goes across the board 25%, then we know. But even then, we won't know quite what it takes to get the tariffs lifted, because I think that's the weak spot always in Trump's use of tariffs, is under what conditions do they get lifted. That's a problem in general with any use of economic statecraft. But so long as they're not levied, or they're levied at one rate and there's a question mark about going higher, the threat is going to be there for at least 4 years. So the US, the UK, and every other country has to get very comfortable and tactical, but also strategic about how to deal with this level of daily uncertainty and unpredictability about what's going to come. And I agree that just sort of sitting there and hoping that it goes away is not a good idea, because it's, even if it's a deferred use of the tariffs, as soon as Donald Trump takes exception with a broader policy conversation, because again, we don't know if this is about bilateral trade deficits or whether this is about the UK not stepping up to a higher level of defense spending fast enough, or not aligning on whatever the China policy is that's developed in the months ahead. Any one of those decisions taken by the UK could lead to the use of tariffs as in effect, a sanction or punishment or a condition. And again, this is the problem. We don't know which one of those, and that sort of goes to Mark's earlier comments about, is it a sequencing strategy, and if so, what's it trying to achieve? And I think there is a debate, but equally, they've all lined up, right? There is, and we've heard it said a million times, and it is true that folks understand now that if you want to stay in, don't bother going in if you're not going to, be loyal and follow through on the agenda. So I don't, I think that I guess I would say I'm more worried about Europe than I am actually about Canada. I think Canada's got its strategy lined up and will play that game pretty effectively in terms of what it's going to retaliate with, and that there is a very clear interest mitigating against the US going too far. But I do think that, in some ways, of the different regions that Donald Trump is cast his focus on, that in many ways Europe and including the UK are in the weakest spot.
What about either of you, Greenland, the Panama Canal, both things again referenced, and he talked about territorial expansion. I mean, again, is this just noise, or is there something real behind any of it?
Well, you're tempted to say it's posturing and it'll fade away when it meets up with the reality of the Danes saying, you're not taking our sovereign territory. But, I've heard scenarios played out where Trump simply keeps pushing and keeps pushing the Danes and then eventually makes an offer they can't refuse. And so whether the U.S. actually annexes Greenland or just establishes a far greater degree of control over Greenland than it had before, we have to see that play out. But I wouldn't dismiss it entirely. I don't think it's just pie in the sky. With Panama, same thing. I mean, Trump is factually incorrect when he says the Chinese control the Panama Canal. They don't. Two Hong Kong companies do own ports on either end of the Panama Canal. But again, it's a handy device in any event for Trump. It gives him something that's attractive to his base. It can serve as a distraction if other things he's trying to do aren't going so well. I think that's why you see nonsense like, let's rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. So, there was a lot of this in the first term as well. There was a lot of sort of chaff that he threw in the air. But, it uses up people's time. It uses up people's time on panels like this, and it uses up acres of newsprint, and that's all to his benefit for the things he is trying to get done. I just want, on the UK briefly, I saw Peter Mandelson last week, and he was trying to lay out sort of the way he was going to approach this administration, and a lot of things he said made a lot of sense. Focusing very much on the economic and trade relationship. And it plays to his skills as well. And it's arguably maybe less contentious than some of the areas that he could get into. But I would just point out that the prominent British attendees at the inaugural ceremony were Nigel Farage and Liz Truss.
And didn't Karen Pierce actually?
Karen Pierce, she represented the British government.
But she turned up, I think, to one inauguration thing that Mandelson had been expected to go to. And it was a bit of a surprise. So you basically are in a situation where this government is going to have to deal with the fact that other people are going to be viewed as Trump whisperers and much closer to Trump. And I think Nigel Farage will make no end of trouble for this government in saying, well, the Trump people I talk to say X. The Trump people I talk to don't want Peter Mandelson. He's already doing it. You can see it in, you just ask yourself who's placing a lot of these stories. And so I think, unfortunately for this government, notwithstanding their very good efforts to have Keir Starmer and David Lammy sit down to dinner with Donald Trump last fall in Trump Tower, David Lammy's elaborate efforts to build up a rapport with J.D. Vance, I think it's just going to be extremely difficult for this government to avoid being undercut, not just by people in the U.S. that have their own agenda, but by people in the U.K. that have an agenda that involves undermining the government. And then one final quick thing. The ace in the hole the UK does have, and this sounds frivolous, but I don't think it is the royal family. They need to send Prince William and the King and Camilla and everyone who's willing to go to Washington as soon as possible. And I think this is a chance for the royal family to play a diplomatic role. It's arguably more significant than they've had in quite a long time. Yeah. Leslie, I appreciate we're rattling through the issues here. We've talked about Europe. Obviously, a big issue for Europe is Ukraine. NATO spending is also talked about. Are there any things that we should be thinking about in terms of those policies? Not issues that were really brought up in the speech massively? Yeah,
not yet, because it's sort of not core to what's closest to home. There was so much focus on the homeland in one sense. I mean, again, I agree with everything Mark said, especially about the royal family. On defense spending, this is not going away. We all know this, and the numbers are going to go up. We've heard as high as the ask will be for members of NATO to spend 5% of their GDP on their defense spending. We know that pretty much everybody is very far off that mark. But even if you go down, that pressure is coming. It's certainly not going away. The broader question of what the new president, old president, will do on Ukraine, I think we know the broad outlines, and we know that there are no details behind that. What I think the sort of optimistic scenario is that actually he's potentially been persuaded to give more to Ukraine, ratchet up sanctions on Russia in order to persuade everybody to talk. And then it's not clear what happens. What is the U.S. under Donald Trump willing to do in terms of security assurances? Who actually looks after whatever border is agreed? Does it just, continue to be a period of quiet where Russia rearms and gets ready to fight again? And what is the U.S. plan for guarding against that? And unfortunately, the patchwork of national security officials, some are, quite good. And others, I think people are obviously very concerned about Hegseth if he gets through, and it right now looks like he's going to get through. It's not even clear at the moment who's running the Defense Department, but hopefully by the morning, or maybe, at the moment it's been solved. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, but I want to come back to one thing Mark said, because I think it's so important, and it was your question about, as he pushes the boundaries of sovereign territorial claims, is he serious or is it talk? And I think it's really serious. And it's along the lines of, it's what Mark said, it's that he's trying to set a new way of thinking about borders. What's he doing in Panama? He's both putting it out there as we could do this. There's plausible deniability. He's also saying to Central America and to Latin America, watch out, China. Watch out what your relationship is with China. We are taking note, and it matters, and we will take steps. Who knows what they'll be? It's back to that uncertainty. On Greenland, we know that, this has been around a little bit for a while. It's now top of mind. And I do think he'll keep pushing on that. And in terms of how it plays out, it could be it's likely to be incremental. But I suspect that when we're back here in 4 or 5 or 6 years, that the way we think about Greenland will not be the same way that we think about it now. And he's looking at that map and he's going, Canada, Greenland, the Arctic, Russia, China, climate change, sea lanes, America's geopolitical footprint. It's absolutely there. But he doesn't have the strategic follow through. So again, there is going to be just that uncertainty as to how far that boundary is going to be pushed, who below him or in his top table is going to decide to take it forward, if and when, and through what mechanism. And I don't think it's going to be, troops going in and taking over. But I think that it isn't going to remain stable and continuous. I think the map is going to change over time.
Mark, I'm conscious you've got to head off, and this has been, as I say, a complete rattle through all of that. The one thing that the Labour government do have on their side, I suppose, is time. They've got a 5-year term, technically. Trump has got a 4-year term. We were talking in the green room about how, actually, at the midterms, the picture could change massively, changes to the House and Senate. What do we think, though? How is the US going to look politically towards the end of that period of time? Is this, is the Republican Party going to keep on this track, or are we seeing the last sort of 18 months, 2 years of a Trump approach?
Well, as we were talking about earlier, it is true that unless Trump suspends the rules applying to how often you can run for president, he will be a lame duck in 2 years. And
you said you wouldn't count that out.
No, I think that's actually very important, because if Trump were to lose control of the House and the Senate, which he did in his first term, if you remember, the last 2 years of Trump's first term were quite different than the first 2 years. Which is typical of American politics. Many presidents come in with a great deal of momentum, and it stalls out very much after a midterm setback. He's got very finely balanced majorities in the House particularly, but even the Senate, which means he could lose both of those houses in the midterms. And if he does, remember, then the situation changes a lot for him. Then every one of those oversight committees in the House and Senate is now in the control of Democrats. And Democrats can actually turn on kind of the oversight and legal challenge aspect of their jobs that they currently won't be able to do. And that puts him much more in the crosshairs. There'll also then be, as you say, a major debate within the Republican Party about what sort of the post-Trump era looks like. And you'll have obvious people who will want to inherit the mantle, J.D. Vance being probably top of the list, but other very ambitious Republicans, some of whom are in the Trump administration. Marco Rubio did not give up his Senate seat to become Secretary of State because he didn't have broader ambitions. So you will have some powerful Republicans jockeying to define that post-Trump world. Now, a lot of this is unpredictable because we have no idea whether Trump's economic policy is actually going to juice the stock market and make a lot of Americans happy, or whether his tariffs are actually going to hurt economic growth, increase unemployment, and leave the U.S. very grouchy in 2 years. We don't know that outcome, and that'll have a lot to do with what the debate within the Republican Party looks like. And then the other point to make is the Democrats will have 2 years to lick their wounds, get themselves organized, figure out what is the right approach for rebuilding. How do you reach those 77 million Americans that they failed to reach in the last election? And, you know, lost in the Democratic defeat is the fact that there are a generation of quite successful governors in particular, all of whom have broader ambitions. So for all the bleakness that many of us feel this morning, you can look forward to a future with a re-energized Democratic Party, both on Capitol Hill and more broadly in the country, and a Republican Party that may take stock after these 2 years of enormous wrenching changes and be ready to reposition itself. So American politics is going to be absolutely fascinating and dynamic, and I don't believe the only scenario is the creeping Viktor Orbanization of America. One could feel that way a bit this morning, but that's only one scenario. And I think if we learned anything about Donald Trump is the capacity for unexpected outcomes.
Well, lots for us to keep coming back to, I'm sure then. A good note for us to finish on. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Lots for us and for Number 10 to be thinking about. We're going to return in 15 minutes for the official start of the IFG's Government 2025 conference, and our director, Hannah White, and an action-packed programme for the rest of the day. But it just remains for me to thank our panellists. Thank you to Mark. Thank you to Leslie for joining us. Thank you for all joining us here today. And thank you to our partners, Grant Thornton, for their sponsorship of the day. And see you all in 15 minutes.